Hello, this is Morel Bernard with a Christmas story, the burglar, and the blizzard. And by the way, please subscribe, please share, thank you. Geoffrey Holland stood up and for the second time surveyed the restaurant in search of other members of his party. Two fingers in the pocket of his waistcoat, as if they had just relinquished his watch. He was tall enough to be conspicuous and well-bred enough to be indifferent to the fact. Good-looking in a bronze, blonde, clean-shaven way, and branded in the popular imagination as a young and active millionaire. At a neighbouring table, a man leant forward and whispered to the other men and women with him. "Do you know who that is?" "Oh, that is young Holland." "What, that boy? He doesn't look as if he were out of school." "No," said one of the women, elaborating the comment. "He does not look old enough to order a dinner, let alone managing mines." "Oh, I guess he can order a dinner all right," said the first man. "He's older than he looks. He must be 26. What do you suppose he does with all that money?" The first thing he did with it at the moment was to purchase an evening paper, for just then he snapped his fingers at a boy who promptly ran to get him one. "Well, one thing he does," answered the man who had first given information. "He has an apartment in this building upstairs, and I bet that cost him a pretty penny." In the meantime, Holland had opened his paper, scanned the headlines, and was about to turn to the stock quotations when a paragraph of interest caught his eye. So marked was the gesture with which he raised it to his eyes that his admirers at the next table noticed it and speculated on the subject of the paragraph. It was headed, "Millionaires' Summer Homes Looted," and said further, "Hillsborough, December 21st, the fourth in a series of daring robberies which had been taking place in this neighborhood during the past month occurred last night, when the residence of C.B. Vaughan of New York was entered and valuable wines and a bric-a-brac removed. The robbery was not discovered until this morning, when a shutter was observed unfastened on the second story. On entering, the watchman found the house had been carefully gone over, and although only a few objects seems to be missing, these are of the greatest value. The thief apparently had plenty of time, and probably occupied the whole night in his search. This is the most remarkable because the watchman asserts that he spent at least an hour on the piazza during the night. How the thief effected an entrance by the second story is not clear. During the past 5 weeks, the houses of L.G. Inns, T. Wilson, and Abraham Marheim had been entered in a manner almost precisely similar. There was a report yesterday that some of the Marheim silver had been discovered with a dealer in Boston, but that he could not identify the person from whom he bought them further, and that she was a young lady to whom they might very well have belonged. The fact that it was a young lady who disposed of them to him suggests that the goods must have changed hands several times. The Marheim family's abroad, and the servants. Oh, here a waiter touched his elbow. "Mr. and Mrs. Vaughan have come, sir," he said. "Send up to my apartment and tell Mrs. May we are sitting down to dinner," returned Holland promptly, and advanced to meet the prosperous-looking couple approaching. "I'm afraid we are late," said the lady, "but can you blame us? Have you heard? We have been telegraphing to Hillsborough all the afternoon to find out what has gone. You are not too late. My sister's not come down yet. I was just reading about your robbery. Have you lost anything of value?" "Oh, I suppose so," said Mrs. Morgan cheerfully, sitting down and beginning to draw off her gloves. "We had a Van Dyck etching and some animals that had gone, certainly. And Charlie feels awfully about his wine." "Yes," said Mr. Vaughan gloomily. "I tell you, he is going to have a happy time with that champagne. It is the best I ever tasted." "Upon my word," said Geoffrey, "they are a nice lot of countrymen up there. 4 robberies, and not so much as a clue." "You need not be afraid," said Mrs. Vaughan rather spitefully. "In spite of all your treasures, I don't believe any thief would take the trouble to climb to the top of your mountain." Holland's selection of a distant hilltop for his large place pleased no true Hillsboroughite. As an eligible bachelor, he was inaccessible, and as a property holder, he was too far away to increase the value of Hillsborough real estate by his wonderful lawns and gardens. Mrs. Vaughan's irritation did not appear to disturb Geoffrey, for he laughed very amiably, and replied that he could only hope that the thief was, as a poor pedestrian, as she seemed to imagine, as he should not like to lose any of his things. And he added that, in his opinion, Vaughan ought to be starting for Hillsborough at once. "Pooh," said that gentleman. "I can't go with the market in this condition. Would lose more than the whole house is worth." "You would go duck shooting in a minute," said Holland, "and this would be a good deal better sport." Mr. Vaughan ignored this remark. "The thing to do," he said, "is to offer a reward, a big enough reward to attract some first-class detective." "All right," said Geoffrey, reddening. "I'll join you. Those other fellows ought to be willing to put up 1,000 apiece. That will be 5,000. Is that enough? We can have it in the papers tomorrow. What shall I say? $5,000 reward will be paid for information leading to the conviction, and so on. I'll go and telephone now." And with a promptness which surprised Mr. Vaughan, he was gone. When he came back, his sister was in her place, and they were all discussing the burglary with interest. Mrs. May, who was somewhat older than her brother, had some of the more agreeable qualities of a gossip. That is to say, she had imagination and a good memory for detail. "For my part," she was saying, "I have the greatest respect and admiration for him. Do you know, he could not find anything worth taking at the Wilsons', after all his trouble. I have often sat in the drawing-room myself, and wondered if they should offer me anything in it as a present, whether I could find something that would not actually disgrace me. I never could. He evidently felt the same way. The Wilsons make a great to-do about the house having been entered, and tell you how he must have been frightened away by the hideousness of their things. Those woolly paintings on wood, and the black satin parasol that turns out to be an umbrella stand." "My dear Florence," said her brother mildly, "how can a black satin parasol be an umbrella stand?" "Exactly, Jeff. How can it? That is what you say all through the Wilsons' house. How can it be? However, it is not really black satin, only painted to resemble it. The wastepaper baskets look like trunks of trees, and the matchboxes like old shoes. Nothing in the house is really what it looks like except the beds, and they look uncomfortable. And someone who had stayed there told me that they were." Dear Florence, said Mrs. Morgan, is it not like her kindness of heart? It runs in the family to try and make my burglary into a compliment. But really, though, it is flattering to be robbed by a connoisseur. I could forego the honour. You see, you have taken away my last hope that my very best escaped his attention. No, indeed, the best is all he cared for. Honestly, Jane, haven't you an admiration for a man of so much taste and ability? Just think. He has entered 4 houses, and there is not the slightest trace of him. There must be traces of him, said Geoffrey. The Innes house was entered after that snowstorm in the early part of the month. There must have been footprints. Of course, said Mr. Vaughan, that is what makes me think that the watchmen are in it. It's probably a combination of 2 or 3 of them. Well, that lets Geoffrey out, said the irrepressible Florence. No one would take his watchman into any combination. He is 1,002 and feeble for his age. However, there is no use in discussing the possibility, for it is not a combination of watchmen, begging your pardon. Mr. Vaughan, it is lovely genius, a slim, dark figure in a slouch hat. That is the way I imagine him. Do you really suppose that a watchman would take 6 pair of Mrs. Innes's best linen sheets, embroidered in her initials, the monogram so thick that it scratches your nose, and a beautiful light blue silk coverlet, all just out from Paris? I saw them when she first had them. What? Said Geoffrey, addressing the other male intellect present. Do you make of the young woman who disposed of some of the Marheim silver in Boston? But it was Mrs. May who answered. She is, of course, the lady of his love, a lady, doubtless, of high social position in Boston. There was a book about something like that once. He's just waiting to make one more grand coup, rob the bank or something, and then the world will be startled by the news of their elopement. They will go and live somewhere luxuriously in the South Pacific, and travellers will bring home strange stories of their happiness and charm. Perhaps, though, he would turn pirate. Oh, that would suit his style. I hope, said Holland, that he won't take a fancy to rob the Hillsborough Bank, for I consider it public-spirited to keep quite a little money there. You begin to make me nervous. No bank robbery would make me nervous, replied his sister. That is the comfort of being insignificant. I have not enough money in any bank to know the difference. And as for my humble dwelling in Hillsborough, who would take the trouble to rifle it when Geoffrey's palace is within an easy walk? Besides, I haven't anything worth the attention of a respectable burglar like this one. Oh, thank you, said Geoffrey. I'm sorry I spent so much time choosing your Christmas present a year ago. Oh, of course, Jeff dear. That wonderful old silver is valuable, but it is put away where I defy any burglar to find it. There is only one sable coat, and I am going to send for that as soon as I have time to have it cut over. In my opinion, said Mr. Vaughan, the man is no longer in the neighbourhood. He would scarcely dare try a 5th attempt while the whole country was so aroused. You see, Hillsborough has always been an attractive place to thieves. It is such an easy place to get away from. 3 railroads within reach. A man would be pretty sure to be able to catch a passing freight train on one of them at almost any time, to say nothing of the increased difficulty of tracing him. "I don't suppose he will ever be caught," said Flores. "When he has got all he wants, he will simply melt away and be forgotten. If he were caught—" Here she was interrupted by the waiter, who laid a telegram at her plate. It had come to her brother's apartment and been sent down. "Who is telegraphing me?" she said as she tore it open. "I hope Jack has not been breaking himself." "Open it," she read. "Your house was entered about 5 o'clock this afternoon. Tea set and sable coat missing." The next evening, at 7 o'clock, Holland stepped out of the train on the Hillsborough station. He wore a long fur coat, for the morning had been bitterly cold in New York, and though the snow was now falling in small, close flakes, the temperature had not risen appreciably, and a wild wind was blowing. He looked about for the figure of MacFarlane, for he had telegraphed the old man to meet him at the train with a trap, but there was no one to be seen. The station, which in summer on the arrival of the express was a busy scene with well-dressed women and well-kept horses, was now utterly deserted except for one native who had charge of the mails. "Hello, Harris," Geoffrey sang out. "Is MacFarlane here for me?" "Ain't see him. Guess it's too stormy for the old man," Harris replied, dropping the mail bag into his wagon. "Then you've got to drive me out." "What? All the way to your place? No, sir. I guess it's too stormy for me too." But Geoffrey at last, by the promise of 3 times what the trip was worth, induced Harris to change his mind. He stepped into the mail cart, and having stopped at the post office to leave the bag, and at the stable to change the cart for a sleigh, they finally set out on their 5-mile drive. "Guess you come up to see about Mr. May's house being robbed," Harris hazarded before they had gone far. "You're a nice lot, aren't you?" returned Geoffrey. 5 robberies and not a motion to catch the thief." "Oh, I don't know. There's a big reward out today," said Harris, divided between pride in the notoriety and shame of the lawlessness of his native town. "Yes, but not by any of you." "Well, the boys did talk some of the vigilance committee if any more houses was robbed. They're going to wait for him to make up his half-dozen." "Well, to tell the truth," said Harris, "it seems like he only went for you city folks, and I guess the boys thought you could better afford to lose a few things than they could to lose their sleep. That's about the size of it." Geoffrey could not but laugh. "That's a fine-spirited way to look at it, I must say." "Well," returned Harris, who appeared to have need of the monosyllable in order to collect and arrange his ideas, "'tain't lack of sand exactly, either, for most of the fellas about here thinks it. There's a woman." "A woman?" cried Geoffrey, remembering the lady in Boston. "Yes, sir," said Harris. "A young woman. Look at the things, too. What burglar would want sheets and a lady's coat? Besides, just before the first one happened, Will Brown, he was driving along up your way, and a young woman, pretty as a picture, Will said, slips out of the wood and asks for a lift. Well, Will takes her some 2 miles, and when they got to that piece of woods at the back of your place, she says of a sudden that she guesses she wants exercise, and will walk the rest of the way, and out she gets. And no one has seen her since. Seems kind of strange. No house but yours within 6 miles, and you away." "It would have been quite as strange if I had been at home," returned Geoffrey, amused at his imputation. Well, Harris went on, imperturbably, you can't tell the rights of them stories. Will Brown, he's a liar, just like all the Browns. Still, this time he seemed to think he was telling the truth. Looks like we were going to have a blizzard, don't it? When they reached the McFarlane cottage, Mrs. McFarlane appeared bobbing on the threshold. She was an old Scotch woman and covered all occasions with courtesy. It appeared that Holland's telegram had been duly telephoned from the office, but that her husband was down with rheumatism, the second gardener dismissed, and the boy allowed to go home to spend Christmas, so that there had been no one to send. Geoffrey suggested that she might have telephoned to the local livery stable, and she was at once so overcome at her own stupidity that she could do nothing but bob and murmur, until Geoffrey sent her away to get him something to eat. It was about 10 o'clock, when he determined to take a turn about his house. The next day he intended removing all valuables to the vaults of the Hillsborough Bank. It was a long walk from the cottage, and Geoffrey, as he trudged uphill against the wind, was surprised to find how much snow had already fallen. He had expected to return to New York the next day, but now a fair prospect of being stalled on the way presented itself. It took him so much longer to reach the house than he had supposed that he abandoned all idea of entering it. It stood before him, grimly, like a mountain of grey stone, its face plastered with snow. He walked round it, feeling each door and window to be sure of the fastenings. Once past the corner, the house sheltered him from the wind. He was conscious of that exhilaration snowstorms so often bring, while at the same time the atmosphere of desolation that surrounds all shut-up houses, even one's own, took hold of him. Unconsciously he stopped and felt in his pocket for his revolver, and at the same moment, faintly in the interior of the house, he heard a clock strike. The sound was not perhaps alarming in itself, yet it sounded ominously in Geoffrey's ears. He recognized, or thought he recognized, the bell. It was that of an old French clock he had bought, and never had put in order. He had never been able to make it go, but once touching it, inadvertently, he had aroused it in a breath of life, so that it had struck one. The same sweet, piercing note, who, he wondered, was touching it now. Who, indeed, is touching it now? Join me for continuation story of A Christmas Carol. Oh, the burglar and the blizzard, A Christmas Carol, the burglar and the blizzard. Join me for the next episode of A Christmas Carol. Me Morale, and please subscribe, please share. Join me for the next video of A Christmas Carol, the burglar and the blizzard. See you then. Morale, bye.